Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Templeman, and I am an educational specialist at Tech Manitoba. I am delighted to be your host this afternoon. Thank you to the Internet Society Canada chapter for providing us with this opportunity to discuss these pressing and critical issues. Tech Manitoba represents Manitoba's growing tech sector. We are an industry-led association that helps companies thrive and grow through collaboration, education, and promotion. If you're interested in becoming more involved in technology, we host events and discussions on a regular basis, and it'd be a great opportunity to network and learn from professionals in the field. To stay up to date, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, and Paul is going to drop that in the chat. ICTC, they are a nonprofit national center of expertise for the digital economy. ICTC is a trusted source for evidence-based policy advice, forward-looking research, and creative capacity building programs for the digital economy. In July 2020, Tech Manitoba enlisted the expertise of ICTC and the Brandon University to assist us in conducting research for the current state of digital literacy with a focus on inadequate and inequitable access to internet connectivity, and specifically its effects on education and learning in Manitoba. This project was conducted in 2 phases, where phase 1 was undertaken by ICTC, and it is the subject of our discussion panel today. Phase 2, which is currently underway with Brandon University, will be primary research guided by the findings of phase 1. The final report is expected in a few weeks, so this will give us an opportunity for an overview of some of the findings, and we are fortunate enough today to have the gentleman who is helping to make this all happen. I would like to welcome Nathan Snider, the Manager of Research and Stakeholder Engagement for ICTC. Nathan has taught in the School of Business and Management at Canadore College, as well as Cambrian College. He's on the board of directors of the Near North Mobile Media Lab, co-founder of Co-Design. Nathan's previous research was focused on the social and economic barriers of the ICTC field facing Indigenous communities in Canada, as well as the tech equity issues as they're related to broadband connectivity and low income families. Nathan will kick us off with a quick overview of the research, and then we have a packed panel ready to discuss and debate how these issues are impacting parents, children, and learning of all sorts across Canada. What do policy and decision makers need to hear and understand? Nathan, over to you.
Can everyone hear me okay right now? Yeah, excellent. Okay, I'm using new earbuds, so I was worried about tech issues. I'm just going to do a bit of screen sharing, but I just want to start by saying thank you for the very nice introduction, Joel. I appreciate that greatly. So if everyone here bears with me for a minute, I will kick things off. So what I wanted to do is provide a bit of an opportunity. Can I get a thumbs up if everyone can see the screen properly? Yeah, excellent. So what I wanted to do is kind of kick things off as a bit of a context bookend framework for today's conversation by really highlighting some of the research that Joel just mentioned that we're engaged in. So ICTC is a national center of expertise as it relates to Canada's digital economy, but we had the pleasure of really diving into the issue of digital equity and sort of what that looks like. And for those of you that are joining us right now that had the opportunity of actually participating in the previous conversation, you'll notice that there's a bit of an ongoing narrative here surrounding quality internet access, connectivity, and the various ways that that implicates the Canadian experience as we know it. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that Laura brought up in the previous panel is this concept of power distribution issues as it relates to connectivity, and that being like a new way of sort of understanding this kind of issue. So as I go through this material, I'm going to blow through it. There's quite a bit, as Joel mentioned, that's coming out in the next couple of weeks. This is really just a primer for today's conversation. So I encourage you to ask questions if this does prompt anything, but really it's just kind of laying the framework. But I'd like to keep that idea in mind. So this is really now turning into a conversation about power distribution issues as it relates to equity. So there we go. So just as Joel mentioned, sort of the idea here behind why the research was being conducted in the first place was to really gain clarity on the relationship between broadband infrastructure as it relates to education and tech equity, in hopes of providing or aiding in the development of provincial strategies across Manitoba. In addition to that, this is a bit of an environmental scan. So all the research that will be displayed in this report is environmental scan secondary lit analysis. But our aim or our goal is to help identify the information needed to actually help shape informed evidence-based public policy. And that's what we were dedicated to doing. I just wanted to add to that concept of the bookend of power distribution, power struggle issues, and kind of frame based on what actually came out of the University of Texas at Austin, this concept of digital equity and what it means. A lot of people often use it, very few maybe could define it in a bit of an elevator pitch, but I wanted to start today's conversation by doing that. So digital equity has primarily 5 key dimensions associated to it, and one of them is access to hardware, software, and connectivity in the internet. So that is literally the foundational element of digital equity.
Nathan, can you pop that into presentation mode? It's a little small.
Yeah, absolutely. I believed it was in presentation mode.
You may just not be sharing the right part, sorry.
Is it frozen by chance? Does it say broadband access digital equity?
Yes, but we see both panels.
Oh, interesting. All right, just bear with me here and I'll try to address that. There, let me know if that helps address the issue.
Yes, we're all good, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So it has 5 different key dimensions. One of them, the foundational element being connectivity, software and hardware. The second being meaningful, high quality, culturally relevant content in local languages. So really interesting if we take into consideration, obviously, Canada's Indigenous population, which obviously has a very strong presence within Manitoba, and is kind of a foundational marker for any of the research that we plan on conducting or continue to plan on conducting across the province. Creating, sharing, and exchanging digital content, access to educators who know how to use digital tools and resources, which is really interesting when you think about digital equity and the concept of having education sort of play into this, and everyone that's on today's panel. And then lastly, high quality research, which is the foundational kind of piece to any community development initiative, whether it be helping shape public policy or potentially the development of new NGOs that are dedicated to help kind of bridge this digital divide. So education, connectivity, and COVID-19, I wanted to kind of highlight, obviously, the pandemic and kind of one of the central themes of the previous conversation that we just overheard in the previous panel. But COVID-19's impacted, obviously, in a variety of different ways and necessitated the immediate and widespread adoption of online or distance learning technologies, which for a lot of communities, a lot of homes, kind of further exacerbated issues that were already prevalent long before COVID-19 ended up negatively influencing a lot of communities. It makes the idea of engaging even in the educational process as a student, potentially a family member, maybe even a mature learner, to even engage with that educational process. And in recent ICTC research on a previous EdTech report, issues of economic inequality were highlighted by several respondents through a key informed interview process that we conducted nationally. So to say that this is an isolated incident here in Manitoba, that is simply just not the case. And as the previous speakers highlighted, this is a widespread issue. Connectivity challenges negatively influence the student learning experience right across the board. And these issues were cited by also negatively impacting the educator's experience. If connectivity doesn't simply have a foundational kind of component to the modern educational process, teaching experience, well, the reality is we can't have expectations of educators to simply know how to adopt and apply these new technologies as they continue to expand. We have to sort of reshape what this means to us, what the expectations that we have of ourselves, of our country, of broadband infrastructure, the teaching experience, and even the learning experience. We need to kind of flip the traditional narrative on its head. And again, COVID-19 has sort of exacerbated pre-existing negative issues. So I've highlighted here a couple of interesting kind of case notes, but I just want to be respectful of time. there were a few digital trends in the classroom that were taking place, like I mentioned previously. And one of them that I wanted to particularly highlight is the 75% of teachers are assigning homework that requires the internet. As we can begin to understand, obviously COVID-19's influence in this is very high. And we can infer that in a lot of instances, especially right now, for those that are paying attention to the Canadian COVID experience, with the second wave well underway and in full swing, the reason why there's an assignment for a high volume of digital work or homework is simply a byproduct of our current experience. So this is a trend that was continuing long before COVID, but is now clearly, especially with the second wave, making its presence known. And with that, all of the relative issues of connectivity in just trying to participate in the student experience. And many of these teachers now have to find a way to sort of achieve the same learning outcomes dealing with connectivity issues. And this is where it's specific to Manitoba, while also dealing with the fact that a lot of these communities, a lot of their students might not have the equipment at home, might not have the internet connectivity at home, the availability, might have various siblings, parents that are now working in remote working environments. All of these are contributing factors to a detrimental learning experience. This is something I did want to take a moment to reflect on, and I hope this is a primer for everybody else today in the panel. A lack of digital access is a lack of access to education, period. If I haven't done a good enough job sort of highlighting the key takeaway of what we all should be learning from today's session, it is simply this: a lack of digital access means a lack of access to education. And I think there couldn't be a more succinct way of putting it. So obviously COVID-19 accelerated connectivity solutions. So I didn't want to make this completely negative. I did want to highlight that both locally, globally, Manitoban experience, as well as internationally, like I mentioned, there's a lot of really creative solutions and ways communities have begun to sort of address this emergency situation that we keep finding ourselves in as it relates to trying to connect digitally for educational purposes. So I've highlighted a few here. One of them that isn't actually noted here that I thought was really interesting about the really far northern Canadian experience. It took place in the Yukon, where the schools actually became the designated areas or hotspots or hubs for connectivity. And during the emergency transition earlier in the spring of 2020, what ended up taking place is these actually became Wi-Fi hotspots for students to actually go with their families, if possible, with their mobile devices, park inside of cars, and actually get the connectivity from the school that was being broadcasted publicly, just as an emergency way to participate in the learning experience. And if we think about these types of creative solutions, I don't want us to think that if we're shaping public policy and the public narrative here, that's the only way to go about trying to address these issues. If anything, the panelists today are going to be talking about really creative solutions that they've identified. In fact, Rob, who's one of our panelists today, has a great global, nationwide sort of experience as it relates to this. And I hope we can explore that a little bit further. The Canadian standard. So the only thing that I wanted to really highlight on this was the recent announcement by the federal government about $1.75 billion investment to try to connect 98% of Canadians to high speed by 2026. This is really interesting because those in the internet connectivity cycles, including obviously members of the Internet Society, this is a very admirable goal. I think a lot of the feedback that I was reading said, well, we've heard a similar narrative previous to COVID-19 about trying to increase connectivity opportunities. We're not quite there yet. 2026 is actually a few years off and may present a variety of problems, especially if solutions aren't found a little bit sooner. And then
Oh, speaking of connectivity, you cut out there for a second there, Nathan.
Yeah.
Hey, Nathan, I think we can see you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry,
Okay.
It's funny, kind of ironic that connectivity issues are plaguing this presentation.
I thought you did that on purpose.
No, that would have been good. I'm not that clever, but thank you for pointing it out, kid. I appreciate it.
You're all good. You're all back on and live, ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you. So the one thing that I just wanted to mention is that Manitoba, according to our research, Manitoba is actually the second lowest broadband download speeds in all of Canada, second only to the Yukon. And I've actually included some of the broadband speeds here. These are averages, and this is dictated by some of the data from the CRTC, which was highlighted by the CBC a short time ago in 2016. In addition to that, one of the things I should note, because it's a bit of a negative, obviously, is that the average price range for broadband is much higher in rural communities. So if we're thinking about equity and we're thinking about connectivity issues being poor in the north, and if we're thinking about the fact that even though it's poorer in the north, you're also stuck funding to a much higher degree, even the ability to have poor internet, nothing exacerbates the digital divide further than that, as far as I'm concerned. So there's one case study. There's a community specifically in Supai, Arizona, an indigenous community located there that had a really kind of creative solution to address broadband connectivity challenges within their very specific, very challenging geographic region. And that was to essentially create a centralized hotspot so that they were able to provide for a variety of purposes, educational being one of them, healthcare being another, the opportunity to connect digitally to be able to increase sort of the quality of life for a lot of the indigenous community members in this area. And I think it's important to kind of reflect on the fact that this was a creative solution provided by an indigenous community in the US, but many examples exist specifically here. And there's members again on our panel that can kind of elaborate that on that further. But it's interesting to know and to keep in mind that, again, this isn't just necessarily a Canadian challenge, an indigenous challenge, but this is impacting communities abroad as well. There are applications and very easy kind of connections to the Manitoban experience as well that I've highlighted here. But really, not to kind of read off slides, I just want to encourage everyone that once this report comes out, it's really interesting that regardless of whether or not you live in Manitoba, a lot of the challenges and a lot of the things that we actually highlight as part of this report have a variety of other transferable applications in other provinces, very similar narratives that you're going to see and identify that kind of highlight these challenges that, again, might not necessarily need public policy to help shape long-term solutions, might actually require boots on the ground action. So I'm just going to conclude there and pass things back over to Joel, but I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to help shape some of that information for you and share it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nathan. That was excellent. Obviously, for the sake of time, you'll need to read the report for the full thing. There's it was definitely an interesting process to be putting it together, and ever changing, since daily things are changing for good and bad because of COVID.
Absolutely.
So it's been quite a journey. So we have many panelists today, and I'm only going to briefly introduce each of them. We are going to put a link to their bios in the chat, just in case you want to see the full bios. But I'd like to get to the conversation and see what our experts have to say. So the first, Kirsten Thompson, who serves as the Divisional Coordinator for ICT for Mountain View School Division in Manitoba. She's a Microsoft Educator Trainer, as well as a Google Certified Educator. She has a Master's of Education and a focus of curriculum and pedagogy, with a focus on implementation of technology to expand curricular objectives, specifically in remote and rural classrooms. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But Kirsten, a question for you. You work directly with teachers, parents, students in a rural community. If you had one message for the policy and the decision makers across the country when it comes to online learning, what would you tell them and urge them to consider? Kirsten.
Thanks, Joel. Well, I actually prefer the term remote or distance learning over online learning, as we have to recognize that online programming is just not accessible for a significant number of Manitoban and Canadian learners. Right now, current mandates from provincial leaders outline very specific details for school divisions, and they're designed to ensure a consistent delivery for online programming. But right now, they haven't accounted for the inconsistent home environment. So they haven't even ensured that these standards are possible for families, not to mention sustainable. So my primary concern is that digital inequity is going to lead to a widening of the gap between Manitoba students. And right now, our current situation is establishing a very dangerous precedent where we're seeing Manitoba families pay
Just breaking up a
You're
little
just
bit
breaking
there.
up.
in order to access their public education.
So it would last the last 30 seconds we lost there.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to point out that my primary concern would be that digital inequity is going to lead to a widening of the gap between our Manitoba students. and that our current situation is establishing a very dangerous precedent where we're seeing Manitoba families having to pay for high-speed internet in order to have access to public education.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll definitely be coming back. But Wayne Kelly is the project coordinator for the Rural Development Institute. Wayne is in the last stages of his PhD, the focus on rural communities to build digital skills for local youth. He helps lead the Rural Policy Learning Commons project and focusing on increasing rural and northern policy impact, capacity, and knowledge exchange in Canada and internationally. Wayne, you, with your background in research, is focused more on the economic development of rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. How important is education in that role?
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for having me here. And I'm going to actually sort of diverge from sort of a lot of the conversation here in terms around connectivity. I absolutely agree that connectivity is essential. We need to get our communities, our schools, our students, our businesses, our rural residents, our northern residents, our Indigenous residents, everybody connected. But I would actually argue that the digital skills and building digital capacity is even more important than connectivity. And why I say that is actually connectivity is just the first step in actually realizing the benefits of digital technologies. You need to know how to use those technologies, and then you actually need to build a culture of use so that people are using those technologies. And I think for economic development, building that those digital skills, that digital culture is key. An example, I focus more on rural communities, community development, economic development. And for rural communities, Indigenous communities, remote communities, communities that are sort of suffering from that digital divide, I'd ask how many of those businesses in those communities are actually have a solid online presence. And especially right now, I mean, Manitoba's on lockdown right now. So if I was in a small community and I wanted to shop locally, many of the local businesses aren't online. And so it makes it really difficult to actually participate in that digital economy, and those businesses, those community members are sort of falling behind even further. The other thing I think that's really key is that the pace of change with technology, the pace of change with how we're using digital technologies. So rural communities, in terms of from an economic perspective, rural communities need to catch up to where we're at now, and also then be looking forward. And so digital technologies and skills need to keep up in rural areas. World Economic Forum just released a report. They're speculating that in 5 years, 50% of us are going to have to reskill. So if you have rural communities, and it's youth, it's decision makers, it's businesses, it's people that are employed in rural areas, if they're already behind sort of where the current trends are in sort of digital technology use, not only do they need to catch up to today, but we know that in 5 years, they're going to have to reskill again. We're all going to have to reskill again. And so the connectivity in the ground is so important, but it's only that first step. And it really is how we're building that capacity and that culture to use that technology that's really going to impact our rural, our northern, our remote, and our Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Wayne. Dr. Rob McMahon is an associate professor in the Media and Technology Studies unit of the Department of Political Science, Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. Rob's research focus is on the development, adoption, and use of broadband and internet technologies by rural, remote, northern, and Indigenous communities. Rob also co-founded the First Mile Connectivity Consortium and is the co-director of the Digital NWT project, which aims to strengthen the foundation of the community-based digital literacy in the Northwest Territories. Rob, your research and work have brought you face-to-face with these issues across Canada. How does Manitoba's experience compare to others? And what do policy and decision makers need to know to take this rare moment where there is focus and money available to deploy it well?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joel. And it was great to hear everybody's presentation. And I just wanted to point to what Nathan was talking about, and Laura from Open Media, that digital equity piece is so key to this. So it was really great to see that. So I would say in terms of that aspect, we are seeing that across Canada in lots of rural and northern regions. I also wanted to highlight, I really liked how Nathan bounced off like the challenges with the innovations. And I would say that's also what we're seeing in other areas. So I can speak to in the Northwest Territories, we've been running a campaign with Sierra with their internet performance test called #NWT Digital Divide. And we're finding that some people can't even take the test. Their connectivity is so slow. But in other cases within the Northwest Territories, it's really quite fast access. I'm pointing this out to really highlight a couple of things. One is, we are seeing digital disparities, digital divides within regions, as well as, and even within communities. At the community level, we're finding some people get faster internet than others. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is, we've been running this campaign now for a couple of months, and we're getting huge uptake and testing of people that is really bringing that data to light. So I just wanted to point that out that, at the community level, people are interested in tracking their access. They're monitoring both the lack of access and the success and longevity of projects. And this kind of leads into the second piece, what can decision makers, policymakers do? I would say look to the resources on the ground. These are the people that will help track the success of projects, especially publicly funded projects. They can be involved in monitoring their development and their long-term sustainability. Nathan highlighted, we'll hear from people like Ken Sanderson in terms of internet service providers that are operating in creative ways. A lot of times, we hear about the lack of a business case in these quite small communities, but nonprofits are there to fill those, gaps, provide these creative solutions. So there's lots of fascinating work going on across Canada there. And kind of tied into that, I think as we look to solve these challenges around access, think about, we talk a lot about online education, online businesses that are getting developed through access to connectivity. But of course, looking at that underlying infrastructure, that in and of itself is an economic development resource. Communities can lease that to other groups in order to provide a revenue stream. They can hire local technicians. Wayne talked a lot about the digital literacy piece. A component of that could be operating, building, managing networks and infrastructure. So let's look to those kind of solutions too. I think there's a lot of people up in the north and other areas interested in that type of work. So thanks for having me on the panel. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Rob. Yeah, there's a ton of really good projects going on, people working in this, but not everybody gets to see them or know what's going on. So some visibility and some coordination would bring a lot of value to the table. Next, we have Adrienne DiFonzo-Veneziano, who is a learning development specialist at Compugen, Inc. She is an Ontario certified teacher with experience in special education and a demonstrated history of working in both the primary and secondary educational system. She is a Microsoft Innovative Educator and a Microsoft Master Trainer, having trained over 1,650 educators in 2020, most of them since COVID, on the use of Microsoft learning tools and applications for the classroom and beyond. Adrienne, you have been supporting classroom teachers with educational technology all over the country, engaging teachers from urban and rural communities, rich and poor demographics. Where are the teachers when it comes to operating in this new online world, especially since COVID-19 has so vastly changed their willingness and need to use these tools?
Thank you, Joel, for having me here, and thank you for that informative conversation we've had so far. So there is no program that could have prepared educators to teach in a pandemic. And I think one of the things that resonates with me is something that was once said by Winston Churchill, which was never waste a good crisis. And so that being said, I think in terms of teachers and where they are and how they embrace this, and what I've learned firsthand from working with teachers, is that it is no longer an option. It's a need to change the way teaching and learning is currently happening. And to put the connectivity aside for a moment, it's just understanding that there is a fundamental shift in terms of how we teach students, how we create personalized and student-centric experiences, engagements, satisfaction, and results for learners. All teachers, as I've noticed, are on a continuum depending on what their school district or division is employing to allow for this contact with students to happen. And I've met those teachers in their learning journey, depending on wherever they are. So in some instances, they have embraced a technology or a set of tools that has got them full up and running immediately or weeks after the pandemic has set, and some are still on that journey and learning. And I think it's a matter of embracing where they are, as we do as educators with our students, and learning to adopt to the change, but also realizing that we're adjusting constantly. We're adopting to a new normal or some sort of extraordinary normal that will be in place, and being able to thrive in the future in what will be known as our new education system. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. There's so much going on, and everyone, I think, has gotten a new respect for and a new, more close connection with the education system. Anyone with kids who are at home doing this, I think that the classroom experience has more than ever kind of hit home. I think everyone either has or knows people who are going through this. So it's such a very trying but interesting time for teachers around the world, but especially across Canada. Ken Sanderson is a member of the Pineyamuntang First Nation and is currently Executive Director of Broadband Communications North Incorporated, a nonprofit internet service provider with network covering over 1,000 square kilometers. Ken, as the Executive Director of an Indigenously owned nonprofit ISP that has been working over many years to bring improved connectivity to Indigenous and rural communities across Manitoba, with your experience in things that have worked and things that have not, what would you advise policy and decision makers federally, provincially, locally to do to solve these long-standing issues? Ken.
There's a lot of things that can be done. I think, which one should I start with? I think to begin with, the decision makers need to understand the demographics. I'll put it that way, because what I'm about to say isn't really unique to Indigenous communities. I think when we talk about, I mean, it's pretty clear that connectivity, that there's the haves and the have-nots when it comes to connectivity and equity. That apparently that was the last panel discussion, covered it in a great detail. And a lot of the differences end up having to do with different types of demographics, whether it be the rural versus urban, whether it be along the lines of poverty, whether it be along the lines of Indigenous, non-Indigenous, etc. So the challenge is that we're trying to come up with solutions for groups and communities and people that are lacking that connectivity now. But I kind of feel that there's some misunderstanding about the groups are trying to solution for. And that leads to problems in and of itself. I can give an example for the Indigenous perspective. There seems to be a great deal of misunderstanding about how Indigenous community politics work, right? Like, I think it's important for decision makers to understand what do band council resolutions mean, right? What are the different layers of political engagement? There's the community level, where do tribal councils fit in on this? Where do political entities like Southern Chiefs Organization, MKO, AMC, where do they fit in to this mix, right? And when they put out resolutions, how do those resolutions fit into the mix in terms of legality and in terms of consent for communities, etc.? Where does duty to consult come in, right? What are the obligations of these funders around that? These are the kind of questions that I think a lot of our funders just don't seem to have adequate answers to, and it really impacts how funds roll out. So, for me, in terms of how BCN works, is we just operate on the principle that, you know, it depends on the community. Each community has the sovereign will and choice to do what it is they want to do, right? I'm not going to go in there and say, well, no, you have to work with us. It's like, it doesn't work that way, right? They get to choose. So if a community says, you know what, Ken, thanks, but no thanks, we don't want BCN involved, we're going to work with ABC Incorporated over here. Hey, that's perfectly fine. That's their sovereign will and choice. If a community says, you know, oh yeah, sure, we want you to work with us, you know, great. That's the only way I'm going to do it, right? And I think that's part of the issues is that, you know, where our funders don't understand how to navigate some of these things. So that's a big one, I believe. The other big issue that we face is the highways, I'll call it that way, leading to these communities, the information highways. We take any community and use an actual physical highway for cars. There is not a single community that can have economic success if they have no highway leading to them, right? It's an absolute critical thing. But have you ever seen anywhere or any case where the government said, oh, you know what, community? You got to find a private company to build that road for you. Like, really? You know, we don't do that. That becomes a public asset that's built. What you do with that public asset after, hey, now business can fairly compete over it. The information highway needs to be no different. I think the hands-off approach that government takes is wrong because it really only perpetuates the political warfare that occurs. You dangle $1 billion. Oh my God, I guarantee you, you're going to see the sharks come out, you know, and those sharks can come from anywhere. They can be just people with not the right intentions behind what they're trying to do, because everybody wants this money, you know, like the pot at the end of the rainbow. And so you end up with a lot of conflict, right? Like who should have access to that? You know, like you have some, I've seen cases also where, you know, you've got small companies that have invested in infrastructure into a community. I know that happened to us as well, but even not us, but even others in the industry have had the same scenario where suddenly the feds come along and give money to a competitor who's not even in that community and suddenly rendering all your investments useless, right? So these kind of things are major problems, both for industry, whether that's Indigenous owned or not, doesn't matter, and even for communities in terms of what they want to do with their broadband and how much they want to be involved. That's an issue. And I honestly think that, you know, governments need to start looking at this and saying, you know what, we'll build the backbone infrastructure to the communities. And then it's just, you know, anyone who wants to compete over it from that point to the last mile can fairly compete on it. Just like you would with a highway. You build the highway, businesses are going to fairly compete over that highway, right? That's part of how I feel this needs to go. And I really think that the feds need to stop, because what's happening right now is they keep pumping millions into very large corporations who you arguably don't necessarily need the funding help. And they're building these highways into the community, but now you've got privatized highways, right? And it becomes really difficult, if not impossible, for most communities if they want to start up their own ISPs or if they want or whatever, right? Like it just means that's a whole world of economic activity that is completely cut off from them, in many cases without their consent. You know, so those are some of the things that I would say, some big ones, you know, that really need to be looked at. Understanding the groups and the communities that need the support, and understanding how they operate, and understanding their scenarios, but also looking at that backbone piece, you know, saying, you know what, there's certain places where having a public asset makes sense. So I'll leave it at that because there's so many things I could just go on, but.
That's perfect. Thank you, Ken. I mean, absolutely. This is the other thing I'd like to point out is, especially with everyone on the panel, everyone didn't just start working on this 6 months ago. This is effort that's been going on for a very long time. And I think we have a representation here of kind of all aspects of that digital literacy triangle. We have everything from the connectivity to the devices, to the learning to use, that adaptability, all that kind of stuff. And it takes all of this effort, right? Coordinated effort in it. One of the things about the Indigenous condition, if I say it that way, is that some people maybe aren't paying attention to it, or aren't tuning out of it, but the efforts that are going into place to get connectivity to a rural, like a rural municipality, or to an Indigenous community, neither live in a bubble. And sometimes we're treating things like bubbles. The school division or the district is got plans and operating in one corner, but they're not necessarily coordinating or talking to the rural municipality, and they're not necessarily making it easy for the neighboring Indigenous community. Right? Everyone's got their own sovereignty, and everyone's got their own plans and everything. But this is not something that you do without some kind of regional coordination and communication, right? So even understanding, like Ken said, just understanding the differences between the objectives and the way that things are done is a very important first step. So I think that's very important takeaway from everybody today. So I'm going to open it up just to a discussion with everyone. Basically, the question is, and again, with educational focus, we are going down a road, and I think COVID-19 is maybe exacerbating this experience that learners are having. And it seems to be that it's becoming even more so two or more very different experiences, the haves and the have-nots. Where are we at? What can we do? What's the next step?
If everyone's comfortable with it, I actually just wanted to jump in because I think it's really interesting. We've seen every panelist right now speak very clearly from their own professional and lived experiences. We've had two different panelists discuss pedagogical and digital literacy shifts. We've talked about boots on the ground community level change. We've also taken a look from Ken's most recent example, taking a look at financial support, policy, government assistance. And it's kind of creating, as Joel just mentioned, a bit of a triangle between connectivity, learning, and community. And I think it's important because despite the fact that we've touched on a few different subjects throughout the course of this discussion already, it's interesting to note that I don't think that there's any foundational element of this conversation that comes before another. I think that the previous panel even highlighted it as well. It's an interconnected, interwoven issue that doesn't have a clear response, but instead of leaving it sort of vague, I think it's sort of apt that we understand that incremental progress amongst those three different elements of this triangle that I just outlined, I think that's where we're going to start to see success. And I think between the report, between the initiatives that individuals like Rob are leading, research that Wayne's engaged in at the community level, we're starting to see that shift, that forward progress, despite how incremental it may be. I think forward progress is obviously better than none whatsoever. The last thing I just wanted to say is kind of a segue back to what Wayne kicked things off with. Is this idea about connectivity and digital literacy specifically. So Wayne kind of boiled it down further. It's not just connectivity, it's digital literacy. I just want to sort of, I don't want to challenge that. I just want to sort of add to it that the democratization, I think, of education is a really interesting element that sort of throws a wrench in your philosophy there. Just because I think that if we're talking about economic competitiveness, digital literacy, digital connectivity, digital competitiveness, like all four of those different elements, I think that democratization of education is really important to consider here. And you probably obviously address that as well, but I think it links in a bit of the points from the two educators that we have on today's panel. It brings it all together because I think that despite the fact we're talking brick and mortar, we're talking about hard infrastructure, we haven't touched on the concept of the democratization of education yet. So I just want to sort of leave it with you guys to discuss that. Maybe Wayne, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, no, and I think you're bang on, Nathan. We can't preclude connectivity with digital literacy, but they should be happening in parallel, right? Whether you have access to 5 megabits or 10 megabits or 50 megabits, you do have some connectivity. And just waiting for that whole field of dreams approach, as soon as I get my fiber to the community, everything's going to be perfect, doesn't work. In the education world, the question I keep asking in rural communities is, do you have somebody in your community that's supporting your junior high and your high school youth to look at online education opportunities after graduation? What are those post-secondary opportunities that you can do in your communities? I haven't come across the rural community that's doing that yet. And I think that's an example of a real opportunity if we focus on the digital literacy. Some of them are very bandwidth, some of the options are very bandwidth heavy, I know that. but some are, you can download the videos, you don't have to be live streaming, you can actually download them. So there are opportunities there. And I agree with you. I mean, we need to consider that, because that's another example of how rural youth are right now are sort of forced to go to urban centers to take post-secondary education. And that's a whole nother conversation. But the digital element of that is really key. Now, you're right, within a rural community, there's a whole spectrum in of itself of people who have connectivity and the capacity to access that, sort of knowing where to look. So absolutely, we need to address across the board these issues.
Educational progress. Yeah, that's really good. Ken, just based on your experience, obviously being in communities, specifically in rural communities in northern Manitoba, I'm just curious, have you come across the issue of education? Like, has that been, obviously it's outside of your typical day-to-day, but no one would probably have a better kind of firsthand experience having been in communities to see what this looks like. Do you have any thoughts or feedback on that?
Well, it depends on where you're going, where you're looking. So we have communities in Manitoba, a lot of them actually, that still don't have all-weather road access. So that's a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
We still have a number of communities that still aren't connected to the power grid. So they're running on diesel. So that's a big problem.
Yeah.
When you look at the current approach that the government takes to funding projects, it really creates, it really incentivizes private companies rather than community initiatives or nonprofits. A lot of the funds demand private equity or investment. How do you do that as a community initiative? How do you do that as a nonprofit, right? As a nonprofit, you're not even allowed to have a big capital fund saved up and waiting for these kind of opportunities, right? So it's a real problem. All of these funds, I mean, even just look at the last satellite CRTC fund. Where did like 90% of that fund go? To a Bell company, right? Like, come on, like it's 2020. Can't we be better than that yet? It's a big issue. And I think we need to start looking at it. I mean, this is free. There's free money that they're giving, but it's free money where it's slanted towards you needing to have equity into it. So like I say, it's tough for a nonprofit. We can't come up with, because they also the way they roll it out too is a challenge, because it rolls out as they're not funding you per se. You actually have to have all the money up front, and then you have to, put in your claims for reimbursement. But these are big issues, right? Like, again, it favors large entities that already have the capacity to do this. Mm-hmm. The other issue too, so that's just more sort of generally, we have communities right now that trying to look at a solution for them, fiber-backed solution, is not going to be easy. We're talking long stretches through muskeg, through wild territory without roads. How do you maintain that, right, operationally? Yeah. So, it's like that's a come I go back to, like, I mean, some of these communities, we need options that, like there are some places I think where government can play a good role, and that's why I like to use the highway analogy. To me, it's the thing that makes most sense. You try to get a solid fiber line into a place like Shamattawa, for example, in Manitoba. If it was a public asset, because it's there for the public good, you're not going to get rich delivering service to one little community, right? Because there's nothing after it, right? Once you get the fiber there, it's not like there's a gateway to, a dozen other communities after that. It's literally, you're just trenching like 200 kilometers of fiber to one community, right? Mm-hmm. And it's one community that, don't necessarily have, they don't have a whole lot of money kicking around. So like, you can't even, we'll just charge them double what we charge in the city to, pay for our operations. You can't even do that. right?
Mhm.
Not going to happen. So, you know, that's why I do think there are places where government plays a critical role. And I just don't think that they're doing it right now. I think that they're taking the easy way out, which is just throwing money all over the place. And it's just, I mean, we've seen it time and time again. You throw money at a problem without proper thought, and it just doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't achieve the results that we need. We need to actually work in partnership with the government, but like in a real way, you know, and that's not happening yet.
There's a little bit of action in the Q&A in the chat. One of the questions is speaking to the knowledge drain happening, especially in Indigenous communities, which isn't just for Indigenous communities, but that people are leaving. Sometimes, and I think it was brought up earlier, if you have to leave for high school, post-secondary, are you going to come back? Even are you going to consider settling in a place that doesn't have access to high speed? These types of issues.
Is there anyone in particular that's directed to?
No.
Well, I can speak not so much to people leaving community. I can maybe speak to some Indigenous examples of online high schools, for example, that I think just like all communities, right, there's lots of different approaches to these types of challenges, and also lots of innovation coming out. And I think this ties into some of that discussion around how do different organizations and institutions at the community level, how are we seeing them cooperate in order to address connectivity challenges and build out a sustainable, I'm going to call it an operational case rather than a business case, because as Ken put so well, it doesn't always have to be businesses, it can be nonprofits. But I'm just going to point to Northwest Ontario, KNet services. These are fly-in communities. They've been connected to the internet in some cases since 1994, you know, right there at the very start. And they had an experiment that's now grown up into the Kiwetnik Internet High School. And so what this is essentially an initiative led by the First Nations that people were having to leave their communities and go to the south to go to high school. And they said, hang on a second, can we use this connectivity in order to build out community level educational services? So if you imagine, kind of similar to what we're doing on Zoom here, you know, at 12 o'clock, well, 12 o'clock I'd be at lunch, 1 o'clock I go to math, I beam into the math teacher, you know, 2 o'clock I'm going to music, right? And then everybody beams in, because they don't have a high enough population to have teachers that are specialists in all the different subjects, right? So they developed this networked model, but I think what's important to point out is the bandwidth that model used then in turn was shared as a community resource across other areas, right? So they could build a sustainable operational case. They had a solid, you need bandwidth to deliver education, so they could have that predictable bandwidth level, and then that in turn supported the development of infrastructure. And it also created local jobs. You'd have people, on-site technicians to support the teachers and the students. So that's one example in education. I'm sure Ken and others are aware of other ones happening, but
I actually, if you wouldn't mind, Rob, I just want to kind of piggyback off of that. So I've actually had the honor of working with KNet in the past through my organization, the Information Communications Tech Council. And one of the things I just want to sort of elaborate on, and to get back to that kind of triangle that I was helping build earlier about connectivity, learning, and community, is that some of the communities specifically that KNet serves they're not large enough to actually support having educators on site. And they found creative solutions to be able to have coordinators, paid coordinators, not necessarily at the same degree and academic level of an educator, but actually having coordinators on site to allow students the opportunity to stay in very small communities and still participate in the learning experience. So I think that's really important to note, because it kind of comes back to that idea about creative solutions. So we're talking a lot about public policy and sort of missed marks there. We're talking a lot about misappropriated funds. We're talking about challenges related to connectivity. And I think I don't want to make this completely negative. Like, I want to kind of bring it back home again to that positivity. And that's, these creative solutions exist. Like, we can't continue to have panels like this where everyone's discussing various different challenges. Like, the reality is, like, these creative solutions are being deployed, whether or not we're aware of them. as somebody mentioned earlier on this panel. And I think KNet's an excellent example, Rob. So thank you for bringing that up, because I completely forgot about it until then.
There was a comment in the chat as well from Alan. Just going to read it because I think it's excellent. Exchanging the word learning for education expands the scope of the impact of digital literacy beyond formal education and works towards the democratization and lifelong and life-wide learning, which is absolutely awesome. It's true. Like this is well beyond the scope of just the formal education system at any level, but this is how people are communicating and how people are learning and how the internet itself is growing, and large populations are missing out on that. Everyone here is working in some aspect of it, and I think the important part here is that everyone, things are very focused on our own particular environment right now, but having an appreciation or an understanding of what's going on maybe a little bit farther out is, I think, a very important thing. And I think that having all of these different people and all, just even knowing and bringing forward some of the people who are working in these areas and who are doing great work don't necessarily get showcased all the time. So one of the things I wanted to do with the panel was to bring some of the great work that's happening forward and introduce you some names that are maybe hidden in a research paper somewhere, or in a Zoom call somewhere, or in a back room doing great stuff, or Ken on some highway north in the middle of nowhere in North Manitoba. You know, the people are doing great work, and not everybody knows their names. I'm just gonna have one question before I just kind of bring this to a close, but Kirsten, I know you've been having some broadband issues, which is ironically perfect with the school, but your experience in your school division, and kind of, if you can give us a snapshot of what students and parents are doing just to maintain the minimum access to the stuff that is online, and to keep working in their current conditions. What I want to bring kind of home is that I don't think everyone really gets what that experience might look like.
Yeah, we'll go really, really quick because I know we have some really great guests that are going to be popping up right after us. Mountain View School Division continues to be committed to providing hard copy packages, and approximately 65% of our students are receiving programming through that way. So a very complex network of youth support workers, dedicated teachers, and dedicated support staff providing hard copy packages. We've also tried to install Wi-Fi hotspots in all 7 of our Mountain View School Division communities, especially our 4 schools who fall into communities that don't even have cell service. So these are some options that we're trying to build in for our stakeholders, but we recognize that there's going to be an ongoing discussion, and we're still going case by case with families to try and figure out the option that's not only accessible, but also sustainable for them.
Absolutely, and again, with the limited time, which is the tip of the iceberg on this, but even understanding that in these communities, cellular is often the only option, if at all, or they're traveling to a long distance to get to a place. So one family car, or more than one kid, or other life impacts, these things all multiply, and they all tend to pile up on people who may already be disadvantaged for other reasons too. So economics and time and all of those types of things all start to really pile up, and that separation is getting wider. So it's definitely not just a technical problem, but there are definitely some technical solutions in that. And I think that the idea is that there is hope. There is money available, there is attention that is being shown to this, and I think that if we work together and continue to communicate and collaborate, and we can focus on the right things, we can start to really see some of these problems that we've been talking about for a really long time, really start bringing them to a close and make some progress. The basis of any network is better with more connections on it, right? We have, not only are these people who are disconnected not benefiting from the internet, but the internet itself is not benefiting from these people who are disconnected. So this is not just their issue, it's everyone's issue. So I have to bring it to a close just because of time, but I would just absolutely like to thank everyone on the panel, everyone who's doing work in this area, and everyone who's watching who's doing work in this area. I think that we are definitely going the right way, and we need to focus on this and make it all happen and change the way that we learn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spencer, and thank you to Tech Manitoba and ICTC for all of you for putting this panel together. I think everyone would agree that the challenges and solutions that were discussed today would apply all across Canada.